everybody thinks that history is free.
Looks like it's getting ready to work.
I just got a request for third party consent. So that sounds good.
We are on. Great. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the change today. And we have hold on, issue with great. There we go. Sorry, everyone. Having a little issue with technology tonight. We had to switch over to YouTube live stream for some reasons with Facebook. But we're here. My name is Rob Orson. I'm with the Emerging Revolutionary War, and thank you all for joining us on our Rev War Revelry. 4 years now. Been doing this 4 years, April 19th, 2020, when we were all shut in and we decided to do these kind of historian chats and interviews. And here we are still doing them 4 years later, just because we had so much fun doing it, meeting some great people. And speaking of great people, I'm with Lauren Roberts, historian with Saratoga County in New York. First met Lauren, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago at the vaunted Bruce Vintner's American Revolutionary War Conference that was held in Williamsburg, now held in Richmond every March. Realized we're doing some great work up in Saratoga in the county, not just the park, but actually outside the park as well. And Lauren's big part of that. So thank you, Lauren, for joining us, and thank you for rolling with the punches today with the change in the technology.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And real quick before we start going into this topic of this great symposium that you guys are hosting, if you don't mind, Lauren has had a very busy day, which is great that she's here. I'm glad she was able to be here. Talk a little bit about what you all did today. Sounds pretty exciting.
Sure. So today we unveiled three Patriot burial markers at different cemeteries. So there's a partnership between the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, which is based out of Syracuse, New York, and they are tireless advocates for historical markers, and they have funded thousands of markers. They have a partnership with the Sons of the American Revolution called Patriot Burial Markers. It's actually available in 8 states, including New York. I think they have funded over 125 burial markers to date. So we were able to apply for and receive 3 markers. And in order to get the markers, you have to prove with primary source documentation, military service, and then also burial. So you have either original headstone or cemetery records to prove that the Patriots are actually buried in the cemetery. So they will give you a sign that says, let's say, however many veterans you can prove. So it will say at least 17, because sometimes we know that the Patriots are buried there, but we can't actually find those records, or because the headstones are almost 250 years old, you can't read them anymore. They're broken, they're lost to time. So today we made a day of it. We had a great color guard from the local chapter SAR and also the local DAR. And we hit 3 cemeteries in one day. We had a great sunny day, and we were able to dedicate these markers. One of the cemeteries that we were at was the Ormsby Cemetery, which is in the town of Greenfield. And there are 2 Patriots buried there. Isaac Ormsby, who served in the Rhode Island Regiment, but who came to Saratoga in the 1790s. He actually served at the end of the war. He signed up for 3 years service, starting in January 1st, 1781. He was present with Washington's army at Yorktown, which he mentions in his pension papers. And he was discharged from Saratoga in 1783. Later on, he comes back to Saratoga County to find land, and he actually left behind a diary. We have a transcription of it where he talks about his journey on foot, leaving from Rhode Island and walking all the way to Saratoga County. He's with another man, and they're averaging over 30 miles a day on foot to come to Greenfield and find a farm. He purchases a farm. He walks back to Rhode Island and gets his stuff and his family. And then again, another journey back to Saratoga. I mean, when you think about the distance that these people could travel in a day, and of course he was in the army during the Revolution, but just amazing. And actually the farm is still in the hands of descendants today. So it was really great to be able to go and dedicate that marker in front of the Ormsby Cemetery.
Yeah, and that's the fun of being a public historian, right? And is well, the downfall is you work Sundays occasionally.
That's right.
If you work with the public, you got to be available when the public's available, and most public are available on the weekends. But doing stuff like that, right? Like knowing that, hopefully in 50 years from now, grandkids when they're walking around will see these things, and knowing that you had a role in that, or and public historians have a role in those type of things is really fulfilling. Is not just the story you just told is pretty amazing, but actually being able to get that story out, right? These are great stories, there's many great stories. We're going to talk about some here in a little bit, but being able to share those stories to people, um, history is not shared, it's history lost, right? So I think that's what kind of keeps me going. And what I do is being able to share some of these stories with people. And it's also fun too to commemorate, patriots and people that should be commemorated, right? Should be remembered for what they did. So,
Yeah, and I think a note about historical markers also, you don't have much real estate on that marker, right? It's just a couple lines of text. But when you put a marker somewhere, and we have recognizable markers in most states, there's a program. Ours are
right,
blue and gold in New York. And, since the time I was a kid, I can remember driving down the road and wondering what kind of history happened here because I see one of those markers. So the hope is, by placing something like these Patriot burial markers, that people will drive by and they recognize what that sign means. And then these stories will get out to the public. And also, it's a private cemetery. So this gentleman has taken it upon himself to care for the cemetery, and it helps to teach the public about historic preservation, right? If that hadn't been taken on,
right,
we don't know, would that cemetery even still be here? These stones were, I think they died in the early 1800s. But because someone has cared enough to take care of the cemetery and now allowed us to mark it, I think it speaks to pride of place also. When you feel like something important happened in your backyard, you're much more likely to learn the rest of the story behind the marker and also to continue the preservation that you've been doing in the past. And maybe you'll get a local scout troop to come and help you, and then you're passing that idea on to the next generation. So I do like historic markers. I know that there are some holdbacks to them, but I see them as a gateway. You get that kind of little bit of information and it's a hook and it makes you want to learn more of the story. And so
right.
hopefully that's what we're able to do with the Patriot burial markers.
No, you're right. As a child too, driving around, Virginia just had their silver and black, but they're huge. I didn't realize how big these things were until I started putting a few up myself, and it's like, you see them on the side of the road, at least in Virginia, some of them are not in places that you can safely pull off and read.
Mhm.
And, now we've kind of grown into the more Park Service style insert markers with images, right? Image is such a big thing. But there's something about that cast iron marker, right, that draws attention to it. And the preservation story, as you said, so important too. Boy Scouts are great for helping us fix up some of these cemeteries, and you hope that they learn a little bit from it and pass that down. So yeah, it's like a great day. Even though it's Sunday, it sounds like it was a great day. So very
Yeah.
jealous that you had a chance to do that. Um, so we're going to dive into an event that I know this is the third one, if I'm correct, right? Third annual.
Mhm.
So you've all been hosting Women in the War Symposium, focusing on women in the American Revolution. It's coming up next week, I believe, May 4th, correct? Before we get started, you still have tickets left or no?
Yes, tickets are
Okay,
still available.
all right.
Yes.
And we'll
And
put something, go ahead.
you can register on Saratoga 250, so Saratoga250.com. That's where all of the information is for the upcoming event.
And we'll put that in the chat. So I apologize if I'm looking down. I'm actually trying to watch our chat here. It's harder on the YouTube channel than it is on the Facebook channel. So getting used to this. Historians are not great with technology, folks. I apologize. Um, so with this symposium, talk a little bit about some of the topics covering and some you're covering and some of the people that you have coming up to speak.
Yeah. So this, as you mentioned, this is our third annual Women in War Symposium. It started 3 years ago. A gentleman named David Bullard, who was at the time the owner of the Marshall House, which ties in with the story of the Baroness, who I'll talk about in a minute, had an idea to create a symposium that focused on the roles that women played in the Revolution. And the inspiration came from the story of Lady Frederica Riedesel. She was the wife of the person who had her husband was in charge of the German contingency at Saratoga, and she followed her husband into the conflict with her three young children. She had three daughters under the age of 5, and she actually left behind she had a journal and many letters that she had written during the war. And later on in life, her son-in-law convinced her to publish these. And it really becomes a way for us to learn about what was going on during the Saratoga campaign from a female perspective. And she's actually kind of considered one of the first female war correspondents because she's writing her thoughts in her journal and also writing back to her mother about what was going on during the battles. And of course, for us, her journal chronicles the whole time that she was here. But for us, we're interested in what she talks about between the first battle, second battle, and then the siege. In particular, she's traveling in a calash, which is an open carriage. But she talks about all of her preparation to come here before she actually gets to Canada and gets to her husband. And she's not a stranger to this type of life. Her father was in the Prussian army. So when she was young, she spent time following him around with his troops. She did get married at the tender age of 16. So she was a young bride. But by the time she comes to North America, she's about 30 and has 3 children. So she's no longer a young, well, 30 is still young, but she has 3 children, comes into Canada, and then she's following the army down behind Burgoyne. She stays in Fort Edward and talks about, how pleasant it is there before they get to Saratoga, as Burgoyne is waiting at Fort Edward for more provisions. That little skirmish over in Bennington happens, where he doesn't get the supplies that he's hoping for at the supply depot. So the Battle of Bennington has happened. He still doesn't have any supplies, but decides to push forward to Saratoga on his way to Albany, he's hoping. And so she's following along behind. And she actually is privy to some of the really important things that happen during the battles. One of them is the death of Simon Fraser. She's actually in the house waiting for dinner. The table is set when they bring in a mortally wounded Simon Fraser, and actually she talks about clearing the table and about how she's in the house. It takes him a while to pass away, and she talks about being present as that's happening. And of course, she has her children with her, the whole time. Then she talks about the retreat after the second battle. When the Americans are victorious, the British are forced to retreat north to what we now call the village of Schuylerville, but was called Saratoga at the time. And her husband finds refuge for her in a house. We now call it the Marshall House because the house is still standing. One of the few houses still standing from the time of the battles. So she takes refuge there along with the wives of other officers and also some wounded soldiers. So, her first experience of getting to the house, she talks about how there are riflemen across the river, the Hudson River, that are firing on her and her children as they're trying to get into the house. So, she's a mother, she's a wife, and she is hiding in the cellar with other people who are sick, wounded, and worried about their husbands who are also out on the battlefield. And she leaves behind this detailed account of what's going on while she's there. So they're there for a week because we know the time period between the second battle and the capitulation is about 10 days. So she's describing what's going on. She talks about how the women and children they're too afraid to leave the cellar so they can't go anywhere else to go to the bathroom. She talks about the smell of infected wounds from the
Mm,
soldiers who are wounded. She mentions that when they feel safe, they she gets everyone out of the cellar and goes in and cleans it and tries to fumigate it with vinegar and hot coals.
mm,
She tries to organize the cellar as best she can. She puts wounded soldiers in one space and then wives in another space. And she's trying to make the best of a terrifying situation. She talks about how she can hear the cannonballs hitting the house and rolling around over their heads in the cellar. She says she can't sleep at night. Her children's heads are laying in her lap as they try to sleep. She is helpful to the soldiers that are there. She's sharing her rations when there aren't enough, and she is going through tribulation. So one of the quotes is, I was more dead than alive," because
mm.
the whole time she's there, she's also worried about the safety of her husband. Um, she mentions that she's the only wife there who doesn't have a husband that is either wounded or killed during the battles and the siege. So she really was in a terrible spot. And then, of course, when the capitulation comes, the surrender, they become prisoners of war, and they end up. She meets General Philip Schuyler, and she does talk about his kindness towards her and her children, and they end up staying with the Schuylers at his house in Albany, even though the British had burned his country home on their retreat. I'm sure it was an interesting dinner conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
a
but
little bit awkward.
yeah, um, but her stories really help to personalize what was going on off of the battlefield, and it brings a human element to the siege period, and letting us know what was happening during this time of for the British, and for her and her children. It was awful.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like you said, provides a great human side to warfare, which a lot of times when you read these books, we kind of forget these are human beings, not much different than us, just different time and different technology. But this is something I always think about when I read stories like this. As a parent, I can see the spouse going, right? "Well, bring your kids. What are you doing?" mean, I mean,
Yeah,
how common is that? Like, I don't mean to put you on the spot here about, and we're focusing on Saratoga, but like, you know, I've always thought, why are these wives, going with their husbands into an area where there's going to be lots of combat, and then that's one thing, right? But then to bring kids into it to me is just blows my mind. I mean, I can't be alone on the weekend with my two kids with my wife out of town. I can't imagine, going on campaign through upstate New York, right? I mean,
right. Yeah.
why? Like, I mean, maybe they have a
Yeah.
choice. I don't know.
I think so we're speaking about a wealthy woman. So I
Right.
think she did have a choice. But I
True.
also think because of her background, being, having her childhood where she followed her father, I think that probably played into why she chose to bring her children. She didn't also wasn't traveling alone. She had servants that were helping to care for the children.
Of
And
course.
so I think, for her, I think that was a natural course because that was what she had experienced when she was young. I think if you look at it in general, the majority of the women that are traveling with the army are camp followers.
Right.
And I think that in that case, they probably did not have a choice. I think about the conditions that women that were following the army. So I'm not talking about officers' wives now, but camp followers. They must not. I think in general they didn't have a choice. That it was due to the circumstances of economics that they had to follow the army. Either their husbands were in the army and there was no one at home to care for the children, they had to bring them, or they had children along the way. Life continued. There are
Right.
accounts of women giving birth in the camps and while they're marching and traveling. I mean, I think about what as a woman and a mom, if I were in that position, I think the idea of choice is different for a woman than it is for a man at this time. Um, what choice did she have? And I think not just about bringing your children and where do you go for refuge, but also about your loyalties, right? I
Hmm.
mean, it wasn't necessarily their choice about which side of the conflict they were on. Usually it was their husband's choice to make. But I think there are a lot of children present in camps. And I think this case with the Baroness gives us the wealthier side. It shows us, what she's able to do. She lives a very comfortable life on campaign compared to what all of the other women and children were living in the camps.
Right.
But I think she never would have suspected that she would be in the position where the children would be in danger. Um, but of course, it's war, it's conflict. You don't know what's going to happen. She is able to keep them safe, in the cellar. Her husband is not wounded. I mean, there were other women who had come from overseas and then their husband is wounded or killed in a battle. And then what do you do?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
then it becomes a whole different scary situation.
Yeah. I, I was researching the Battle of Camden before the American Army steps off to South Carolina under Horatio Gates. He orders, um, all the civilians back, and one of the officers writes like two-thirds of the people in the army camp were civilians. Some of them were wives of men that were killed that had nowhere to go, and they were only there because the army was providing them some kind of food. So, kind of ties into what you said about if you, and I know we're talking about a German lady, which is totally different, but still, you know, you're going to go to wherever you can get the most support. And for some of those Americans in South Carolina, for the women and their children, it was with the army, and it became a drain, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're trying to feed soldiers, and you also now have to feed these camp followers. So that's a fascinating story. And I know she was kind of the basis for doing the symposium, correct?
Yes, it was her story that inspired. So David Bullard was, when the symposium started 3 years ago, he was the owner of the Marshall House, which still stands. And that was the house where the cellar was, where she was
Okay.
hiding. And so the house has been altered significantly on the outside. It is still in private hands. But the inside, you can still go down into the cellar, which has also
Wow.
seen changes. But you can, I always feel like you have to put your feet where history happened. There's no
Exactly.
comparison to standing on the ground where a, an epic piece of American history took place.
Mm.
And so being able, to experience that in firsthand is really great. Um, so the Friends of the Marshall House started the Women in War Symposium from the
Okay.
inspiration of the Baroness. And last year, Saratoga 250, we partnered with them and we have taken it over now and expanded it. So when they started it, it was a 1 day symposium. And last year, we brought in a bus tour on the second day. So we still are focusing on women. The first day, which is the symposium, we're bringing in scholars from across the Eastern Seaboard. They're talking about, in general, roles that women played in the American Revolution. So we have Dr. Holly Mayer, who's coming to talk about Margaret Corbin at Fort Washington. Of course, she is the first female to get a pension from the United States government for
Right.
service. Christine Velosin, who is the curator at Saratoga National Historical Park, she's going to be talking about the Revolutionary Schuyler women. So people from that were at and around General Philip Schuyler, the country house that was there in what we now call Schuylerville, but was called Saratoga. She's going to be talking about women in the Schuyler family. Frederica Bear is going to be talking about the Baroness. Frederica is actually writing a book about her right now, so can't wait to hear what research she's come up with. Vincent Coretta is going to be talking about Phyllis Wheatley Peters, was the formerly enslaved African American poet. And then Elizabeth Maurer is going to be talking about Martha Washington. So we have a lot of scholars that are talking about different roles across the Revolution. But the bus tour that we have on Sunday is going to focus on women that were involved in the Saratoga campaign. So that tour is being led by licensed battlefield guide Pat Niles. He led a tour last year. When we did our tour last year, we focused on following the footsteps of the Baroness. So we actually started up in Fort Edward, where she was staying with her husband, and followed her journey down to Stillwater, which is the town where the battles took place, and then back up to Retreat, and actually ended at the surrender site because she does describe the surrender in her journal. That's where she meets Philip Schuyler for the first time, though she doesn't know who he is at first, but he's helping her children out of the carriage before she realizes who he is. And so she says, you know, he must be a father because he was very kind to her children.
Right.
So this year we're focusing on different stories other than the Baroness that of women that were involved in the Saratoga campaign. And like I mentioned before, we with the Baroness, we're talking about a wealthy woman, but there's actually a really interesting story about a female who was the wife of a loyalist that we're going to be talking about. So Saratoga National Historical Park, other than the battlefield proper, has several other different sites that were also involved in the Saratoga campaign. One of those being Victory Woods, and that is an area where the British were encamped during the siege period, so after the second battle, but before the surrender date. So Elizabeth Monroe Fisher was a young girl who was the wife of a loyalist who lived in Washington County, which is just across the Hudson River on the eastern side of the Hudson River from Saratoga County. And she left behind a memoir, and she really had really a terrible life. If you want to read a depressing account about how bad can life get, read Elizabeth Monroe Fisher's memoir. She's born 3 days after she's born, her mother dies, and her father finds a nurse to take care of her, and then he remarries and has a stepmother who's kind to her, and then she dies, and then the father remarries a second stepmother, and she is horrible, cruel. She whips her. She locks her in a cellar for a whole day without food or water. She just really has a terrible life. But and her father was actually served as a chaplain for one of the British regiments in the 7 Years' War, but then he is given land in Washington County, which is how they come back to this area. Her father wants her to marry this particular man, and she's about 16 years old at the time, and the gentleman is, she says in her memoirs, he's about 45, he has no teeth, he has gray hair. She refuses to marry him, and her father gets very angry at her. So she chooses another man to marry, and her father, I mean, the letters that she writes, he addresses the letter to something like unworthy child and signs off your offended father. I mean, it's just terrible. So she ends up marrying, yeah, marrying
it's like Footloose, you know?
Yeah, right. I know. She ends up marrying a man named Mr. Fisher, who her father doesn't approve of, but he is a loyalist, and he goes to fight with the British. And so as Burgoyne is coming down, he leaves, and she's alone in the house, and she has a young baby under a year old. And one morning at 6 a.m., she said, riflemen surround the house and they demand to know where her husband is. And she says he's not here. And so they order her out of the house with her baby, and they
Wow.
take all of her furniture out of the house and they burn her house down. And she's in the wilderness with a baby. So
Jeez.
talk about choice. What choice did she have?
Mhm.
She meets a man who is driving a cow along the road, and she asks where he's going. He's going to the camp, so she follows him. She ends up going to the British camp. She talks about how her shoes are not made for wilderness roads. So a few miles in, her shoes are destroyed. She has silk stockings on. She has to take them off, and the whole time she's carrying her baby.
Mm.
She does make it to the British camp, and she's allowed to go in. And then she, of course, is there for the battles, and she also retreats with the army up to Old Saratoga or Schuylerville. And she's talking about how times are getting hard, the provisions are scarce. And so she's in this, it's mid-October, they're freezing. She actually relates a story where they talk about what they're getting to eat. And so she says her daily provision was a piece of raw salt pork, a biscuit, and a drink of water. Now, this is a nursing mother, and that's all they have to eat. So one day she decides that she's going to try to do something about this. So she gets together several other wives that have their provisions, and they're going to put them together, and they convince a couple of soldiers to start a fire for them in the woods. Now, they haven't been able to have fires. She mentions that they can't start fires because the cannon that are placed across the river by the Americans can see the smoke. And so that once they see the smoke from fires, that they will cannonade them. But they decide to risk it. They get soldiers who she agrees to pay them a guinea to start a fire and hang a kettle over it. They put all their provisions together, but they stay back from the kettle because they're worried about it. And she says that a cannonball comes and hits near the kettle and blows the kettle apart, and all of their provisions are lost. And she still has to, she mentioned she still has to pay the soldiers the guinea for being
Right.
able to start the fire, and how desperate they were. But a story like that from someone who has had nothing but hardship their whole life, and then she becomes one of the refugees, a loyalist refugee with the British Army. So her story will be part of the bus tour, and actually we're going to have a couple living historians along the way with the tour. There are several other stops. We are going to be visiting a couple stops on the battlefield itself. Lydia Nielsen, if you're familiar with the battlefield, the Nielsen farmhouse is the only standing structure still on the battlefield from that time period. We're going to talk about Lydia Nielsen, who was also a young bride at the time of the Revolution, and how they had to leave their house, which was only a year or two old at the time of the Revolution. Her husband, John Nielsen, was in the local militia, and so she packs up and leaves and goes to her parents' farm, which was south of there, and their house is taken over by Enoch Poor and Benedict Arnold. So we'll tell Lydia's story, also the story of Lady Harriet Ackland, who there's a famous print of her coming down the Hudson River in a boat in the middle of the night because her husband is badly wounded and taken prisoner by the Americans, and she appeals to the Americans to be able to go across the lines and help nurse her husband. And we have a historic marker up along the Hudson River for Lady Ackland, and we'll be talking about her story as well. So, and there's a few others in there as well, but sometimes having living historians there that are telling these stories, and it helps people to relate to the story. It helps to have a conversation. You're engaging people in a different way. And Pat Niles is a wonderful guide. He does such great research. He really does his homework. And we're really excited. I think the bus tour will really be a highlight of the symposium.
Well, what's amazing about some of these stories is the fact that these women, you know, either kept diaries, letters, and we have access to these things. So can you talk a little bit about, because I know you do a lot of research on your own about, Saratoga, but talk about a little bit about the challenges in researching this topic, women in the American Revolution. I mean, we kind of already know what they are, but the fact is that some of these stories that, yeah, I knew about the Baroness, but the Fisher story I had no idea about. And so there's documentation for some of this stuff. Where are these things being found, and some of the challenges that you face when you do some of this research? Because I think it's fascinating research.
Yeah. In generally speaking, the accounts are largely dominated by males writing these down, and there certainly are documents available, but they're not as prevalent as those written by males. So I think the maybe the reason that so many stories, female dominated stories, aren't told more is not on purpose to neglect them, but because they're harder to find. Sometimes we stumble over these documents, we find them in an archive when we're researching something else, but also, the prevalence now of digital archives in research is really important. Elizabeth Monroe Fisher's memoir is available on Library of Congress. You can go. It's actually, it was published, so it's printed. You can go on and read her account. Um, but in general, it's difficult to find these stories. Sometimes the diaries are kept in family archives and passed down through the years. They're not always put into a public archive. And I also think, and maybe Rob, you've come across this too, when you go out and you try to do oral histories of people, part of the part of part of what you have to overcome is convincing people that their story is important enough to tell.
That's the
And so
biggest
I think,
challenge.
yeah, and I think this is similar with women, right? They see this their lives, their duties as mothers, as wives, as store owners. I mean, we talk about all of the men having to go off to war and being on the battlefield, but what about what the women had to do just to keep alive the homestead or the family business, or being able to feed the children and take care of the livestock. So, they have their regular job and now they're taking on a second job. The demands on their time, no wonder they didn't have time to sit down and write a diary. At the end of the day, they probably didn't even have time to feed themselves.
Right.
So it's not surprising that there are less documents in the record about women, but I think we just have to continue to look harder. And when we find them, it's important that we bring them to the forefront, because we're not taking away anything from what was happening on the battlefield itself, but you're helping to fill in that whole tapestry and telling the different perspectives from what was going on, in inside and outside. And it all helps us in general to understand better what was going on during the revolution and what different people were facing.
And I think too, it's more relatable to us today. Um, so few people, thankfully, have been through combat, right? I know there are those who've done that, but it's fewer and fewer, which is actually a good thing. But most of the men's accounts and stuff talk about what's happening on the battlefield and men moving around the field. But hearing the story about the Baroness, hearing the cannonball, all the things going on in that house when she's in the cellar makes it a little bit more relevant to the average person today, right? So, uh, you know, I do a lot of tours and trying to explain to people who don't understand military tactics. Sometimes they just glaze over when we talk about regiments and brigades moving here and there, but everyone can understand that story, right? Everyone can put themselves in that cellar, um, listening to this craziness going on outside, right? And I think that, you're right. It adds more to the story. It doesn't take away from what the military men are doing on the battlefield, but it does make it more. It's the human side of things, right? So I think for today, for us, for as public historians sharing these stories, it just adds to it, right? And I'm sure the folks at the battlefield park agree as well, because they had the battlefield, but you guys there, the county, are doing some great work focusing on the civilians, which obviously the armies came, the armies left, right? The people who live there are stuck with the aftermath and the impacts of that. So I think, you're right. It completes the tapestry of the story you guys are trying to tell.
Yeah, one of the things I know, and maybe this is true of where you are too, but so 2024 corresponding to the year 1774 and talking about choosing a side, right? The Boston Tea Party has happened. We've got committees of correspondence. We're going in a certain direction. Things are happening, and people are choosing sides. And I think about, when we look back now, it's so easy for us to say, of course I would have been a patriot. Of course
Of course.
I would have fought for liberty and these great ideals that we do move towards. But, in my own thinking, when I think about, okay, would I have been a loyalist or a patriot? The first thing that I think of course, is who would be going off to war? Husbands, my son, and who would be here to take care of, to keep a home, a place to come back to when the war is over, or a place to start. So I think, when you're thinking about taking into account other perspectives of, choosing sides in 1774, the female perspective is going to be different.
Right. So I have a question, open door question for you, and it's more about your personal choice. What is your favorite female story from the American Revolution? If you had to
Oh,
pick
wow.
one, and I know that's hard to do, right? But it doesn't have to be Saratoga, but of course it can be. Um, if you had something that you really enjoyed reading about or researching, you could tell our viewers one of those stories that they should go look into and read more about, what would that be?
Um, I would have to go with the Baroness. I
Right.
just think, because and there are other great stories, but because there's so much material available from her, a lot of other stories like the Elizabeth Monroe Fisher story, or Lydia Nielsen's, a lot of times either it's just a small snippet of that story, or it's a female story being told by someone else. But in this case with the Baroness, it's her story through her words, through her experience. And I think it's so rare to have that. So I would encourage your listeners to learn more about the Baroness. It's just, and it follows, from starting in 1777, but it really follows the rest of the war, because she becomes a POW. So they're traveling with the convention army for a couple years. They are eventually, her husband's exchanged, they can go to Canada, but it continues on. It's not just one little snippet or one battle that she experiences, but it's her experiences over a long period of time, and you can see her grow. She actually goes on to have two more children while she's here, named America and Canada. So you can guess where they
Really,
were
that's
born.
amazing in
Yeah.
itself, right?
But it's so great that these letters and her journal are saved and published. And not to say that there wasn't editing done, that after the fact. I'm not naive to think that this is originally what she wrote in 77 and just got published. There was definitely a selection by her family members that were publishing. But yeah, it's just, I am inspired by her, and I like researching her and the different publishings that have come out, the different versions. So it's just an incredible story.
And so many Germans, not just from Saratoga, but from Trenton as well, stayed here.
Right.
Several hundred make it to Virginia in different camps, and many of them just decide to stay here. Kind of goes in line with what you were saying at the beginning. They didn't necessarily choose which side to fight on. It was part of, we're not go down that rabbit hole with about Hessians, but many of them do choose to stay here and become Americans, right? And that happens a lot in Charlottesville, Frederick, Maryland, other places across Virginia, obviously probably up there in New York as well,
Yeah.
where these
Mm-hmm.
Germans decide to stay.
Yeah.
Like, wow, this is a brand new place. There seems to be opportunity here, and we're gonna make a go of it here. So, um, that amazing immigrants, different immigration than normal,
Right.
but still immigrants all the same. So piggybacking on my second question, now you can't pick the Baroness for this one. So
Okay.
of all the stories around Saratoga, which one do you think it should be highlighted more, or which one do you enjoy the most? It could be any story. It doesn't have to be women at Saratoga. It could be any story. Because I know you guys do a lot of work researching the community and interpreting that community. What's one of the stories from Saratoga that you find most inspiring and most interesting?
Are you talking about the revolution in
Yeah,
particular?
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Because I'm a public historian for the county, so it's
It's a
there are a
broad
lot of
area,
different
right?
era.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I get it.
you're talking about horse racing or mineral springs, so there's a lot up
Right.
here. Um, the revolution. Um, hmm. I I do think that a story that's interesting, and this is another easy one, but Benedict Arnold's story in
Hmm.
Saratoga is really interesting.
Right.
I think it's one of those stories that it's impossible for us to think about him not in not knowing that he's a traitor, right?
Right.
I would love to be able to not know that that's the ending and just focus on his story before, because
True.
I think we would think of him in a completely different way, and the things that he did at Saratoga and before Saratoga. But the story of the way that monumentation has come about from him. So, of course, everybody knows the Boot
The
Monument, everybody's
boot.
favorite monument.
Yes, everybody rushes to see the boot.
Yeah, no name, right?
Right.
It's the boot is there, and the Saratoga Monument, which is the monument that was put up on the 100-year anniversary
Hmm.
of the battles of Saratoga. The cornerstone was laid that year. There are four niches for statues in that monument, huge. And so it's Philip Schuyler, it's Colonel Morgan, Gates, and then there's an empty niche. It's just empty. They built the niche, but it's empty. So, I've done a lot of thinking about monumentation and interpretation, and the way that the battlefield has even formed over time, from nothing to DAR tablets to state preserve, finally to national federal park. But I just what would it be like if we could think about Arnold's participation in Saratoga without knowing the outcome? I think it's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, I think today you see a lot more research kind of focusing on that, right? But you're right. It's hard to focus. I mean, hard to research and read the story or tell the story knowing, right, what happens, right?
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, he is an interesting figure. He is getting a lot more attention now than I think he has in the past. A little bit more kind of unbiased, balanced opinion.
Hmm.
Not defending his decision or his choice, but a little bit more look at, his life before the war and what made him who he was, right? Not necessarily his fighting prowess, but kind of telling his life story because it does tie into why he chose to do what he did, right? So, but you're right,
Yeah.
it's hard because you know what happens.
Yeah. We actually have another story in Saratoga. There's a gentleman named Joe Betties, he's a local guy. He's not famous like Arnold, but his track is very similar to Arnold. He starts out on the Patriot side. He feels like he's neglected. He's not given any kind of accolades for what he's done, and so he becomes a spy for the British. His parents are local tavern owners. They own a tavern and are well known in the community. And Joe Betty's ends up getting caught as a spy. He tries. He has papers in his. I think they're in his hat. He tries to throw them in the fire when he gets caught, and they're able to pull them out and see. He's caught along the road in Clifton Park, which is the southern part of Saratoga County, and he ends up being hung as a spy in Albany. And it makes me think about his parents, because they're public figures because they own a public tavern, and they are on the Patriot side. But what happens to the rest of the family when something like that happens?
Right.
Betty's goes down as a British spy. He's hung, and his parents end up living and stay until their death in the community. So I think when you're talking about different perspectives also, and very much a civil war, but it was, husband or father against son on
Right.
which side, and how does that affect the community as a whole also, not
Right.
just one person, but one person's choices then affect the whole community. So
Right.
it's interesting to think about that.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, because an hour always goes by so fast. So talk about a little bit about Saratoga 250, what you guys have done, what you're
Yep,
currently doing. I know you're doing a lot of augmented reality. I've seen some of it up there in Boston when you were there for the Tea Party, and also at Bruce's Illusionary War Conference, and then some of the things you guys are working towards in the
sure.
future.
Yeah. So I'm lucky enough to, like you, live in a county that recognizes the importance of its history, and none more important right now on the cusp of the 250th than our Revolutionary past. So the Saratoga County Board of Supervisors created a 13-member commission in 2021, and it includes stakeholders from around the county. And our mission is threefold. The first is education, to promote education of our revolutionary past. The second is to increase heritage tourism by providing programming and events that can reach a wide audience. And the third is to improve infrastructure around our historic sites so that we ensure that any investment that's made now throughout the commemorative period lives on and has a longer life, and that we're instilling the values of historic preservation in the next generation, which we kind of talked about earlier. So those are our three guiding stars, because I think sometimes when you have like a huge commemorative period like the 250th coming up, it's easy to just have thousands of ideas. We could do this, we could do this, we could do this, but in using a mission of what you're focusing on, it really helps you to direct your energy and your funding during those 3 points. So yes, augmented reality is a really exciting thing that we're working on. We have developed 4 demo characters, and we're working on trying to fund more of them. One of the challenges that we have in Saratoga, of course, the 2 battles in the siege take place across quite a big area. So we have the battlefield, we have the other National Park Service sites, and we have some public parks, but there's a mixture of public and private land. So in thinking about how can we interpret across this vast piece of land, and with never enough staffing, never enough sites open to the public. So augmented reality and technology is a way that we can do this. And by creating either pocket parks or public places like trailheads, like the kayak. We have like a kayak launch where it goes into the Hudson River. That's an area where we put the Lady Ackland sign. How can we use these places where the public can be to increase and improve our interpretation off the battlefield? So that's how augmented reality has come up. We have 4 characters that we have started with. The Baroness is one of them. Our app is actually on the App Store, both the App Store and Google Play. So if you put in Saratoga 250, you can download the app and you can see the demo characters. It's the Baroness, Burgoyne, Arnold, and Daniel Morgan are the first 4 that we've chosen for interpretation. And we hope that we can keep telling more and more stories. So we have applied for several grants to try to continue that. And right now we're in the middle of an American Battlefield Protection Program grant, which is actually for interpretation, master interpretation plan. And it's focused on looking at underrepresented stories. How do we get those different perspectives out and start telling some of those stories? So that's been going really well. That will be a long-term project for us and something that we can keep expanding. The other thing is our two signature events that we've been doing. So Women in War, we've already talked about, but in the fall, in New York State, we have something called a Path Through History Weekend. And that falls on Columbus Day, which for us is perfect because it usually falls around the same time as the Second Battle of Saratoga.
Right.
So we partner with the battlefield, with the Saratoga National Historical Park. There's a military interpretation on the battlefield itself. And then down at the Schuyler House, we actually have a civilian interpretation where we bring in, we have a blacksmith, a forge that comes from Ohio. We talk about how the army was fed. How do you feed an army? We talk about the medical roles that women had. There are tours of the Schuyler House. We have activities for families. We do walking tours. We include our local businesses too. It's a beautiful time to be in upstate New York with the changing colors and the leaves and the pumpkin patches and all of the apple orchards. So it's a really great weekend and it happens right at the right time for us. And then also we partner with the town of Saratoga and village of Schuylerville to do a Surrender Day program. The county actually this year passed a resolution. So Surrender Day, October 17th, is actually a county holiday now. And
Oh,
we're
wow.
hoping to expand that.
Awesome.
And include more school kids for that. So we've got a lot going on. Of course, 2027 is going to be our signature year. We are looking at some bringing in some really great scholars, making it an international crowd, and of course a large scale reenactment, among other things. I don't want to give away too much, but 2027 it's going to be a blast here in Saratoga.
Well, you were up there in Boston when we were up there for the Tea Party, and it was a huge turnout. Um, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't totally surprised by how many people were there because it was packed.
Yeah,
So
crazy.
I think people are coming. I know we will be there. Me and my friends will be there. We'll be bringing our Emerging Reservoir annual bus tour there in 2026. So um, we're trying to do the anniversary a year before the anniversary to miss the crowds with our bus tours. So yeah, it's going to be great. So as we wrap up here, the third annual Women in War Symposium is this weekend, May 4th and 5th, Saratoga250.com, correct, for tickets. And I'll put that in the chat as well. Lauren, thank you for being here. I know you had a long day doing lots of great stuff up there, and I appreciate it. And thank you for everyone for dealing with the rolling with the punches with us with the technology that we had to change here tonight. But thank you, Lauren, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and we'll be talking about the First Virginia Convention here in Williamsburg, which the 250th anniversary of that is coming up in May. So with that, Lauren, I thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And take care.